Every morning at 5 a.m., when most people were still deep in sleep, Elena Martinez would wake up to the sound of washing machines spinning below her tiny bedroom. The old building creaked and groaned as water rushed through ancient pipes, creating a symphony of sounds that most people would find annoying. But for Elena, these sounds had become the background music of her life. She lived with her mother and younger brother in a cramped two-bedroom apartment right above their family's laundromat in East Los Angeles. The apartment smelled like detergent and fabric softener all the time, and the humidity from the machines below made everything feel sticky during the summer months. Their furniture was a mix of hand-me-downs and items her mother had found at garage sales, each piece telling its own story of previous owners and forgotten dreams. In the corner of their small living room sat an old upright piano that looked completely out of place among their modest belongings. The piano was dark brown with scratches and water stains across its surface. Some of the keys stuck when you pressed them, and it hadn't been tuned in years. But it was Elena's most treasured possession in the entire world. Her grandmother, Rosa, had rescued this piano from St. Mary's Church when they were throwing it away during renovations. Rosa convinced the pastor to let her take it instead of sending it to the dump, even though she had no idea how she would get it to their apartment. It took 6 neighborhood men and a borrowed pickup truck to carry it up the narrow stairs, and Elena's mother wasn't happy about losing precious living space to an old piano that nobody in the family even knew how to play. But Elena was different from the rest of her family. From the moment she saw those black and white keys, something inside her felt like coming home. She was only 8 years old when the piano arrived, but she sat down and started pressing keys, listening to the sounds they made, trying to understand the magic hidden inside this wooden box. Nobody taught her how to play. Her family couldn't afford piano lessons, and even if they could, her mother believed music was a luxury they couldn't afford when they were struggling to pay rent and put food on the table. But Elena didn't need a teacher. She had something more powerful than formal education. She had passion and determination that burned inside her like a fire that refused to go out. She spent hours every day sitting at that piano, teaching herself to play by listening to music on an old radio she kept beside her. When she heard a song she liked, she would try to copy it on the piano, pressing different keys until she found the right combination of sounds. Sometimes she would get frustrated and cry, especially when her fingers couldn't move fast enough to play the music she heard in her head. Her mother, Rosa Maria, worked double shifts at a local restaurant to support the family, and when she came home exhausted at night, the last thing she wanted to hear was Elena banging on the piano keys. "Mija, please stop with that noise," she would say. "People are trying to sleep and you're making too much sound." But Elena's grandmother, Rosa, understood something her mother didn't. She saw the way Elena's eyes lit up when she played, the way her whole body seemed to come alive when her fingers touched those keys. "Let the girl play," Rosa would tell her daughter. "Music feeds the soul, and this child has music in her blood." As Elena grew older, her playing improved dramatically. She learned to read music by checking out library books and studying them for hours. She watched YouTube videos on the computer at school, memorizing finger positions and techniques. She practiced scales until her fingers moved like dancers across the keys, and she learned classical pieces that seemed impossible for someone without formal training. By the time Elena reached high school, she could play pieces by Mozart, Beethoven, and Chopin with a skill that amazed anyone who heard her. But she kept her talent mostly hidden, playing only when her family wasn't around or late at night when she thought everyone was asleep. She was embarrassed about their old piano and afraid that people would judge her family's situation if they knew where she lived. Elena attended Lincoln High School, a large public school where most students were focused on just getting through each day rather than pursuing dreams that seemed impossible to reach. The school's music program was underfunded and understaffed, with old instruments and a teacher who seemed more interested in retirement than inspiring young musicians. But Mr. Rodriguez, the music teacher, noticed something special about Elena during her junior year. She had signed up for his basic music class just to have an easy credit, but when he heard her humming complex classical melodies under her breath, he became curious. One day after class, he asked her if she played any instruments. Elena hesitated before answering. She was used to keeping her musical abilities secret, worried that people would think she was showing off, or that they would want to see her home and judge her family's circumstances. But something about Mr. Rodriguez's kind eyes made her feel safe enough to tell the truth. "I play piano a little bit," she said quietly, looking down at her worn sneakers. Mr. Rodriguez had been teaching for 25 years, and he had developed a sixth sense for recognizing real talent hiding behind modest words. "Would you mind playing something for me?" he asked gently. The next day, Elena stayed after school and sat down at the old piano in the music room. Her hands were shaking as she positioned her fingers on the keys, nervous about playing for someone who actually understood music. She decided to play one of her favorite pieces, Chopin's Minute Waltz, something she had learned by watching countless YouTube videos and practicing until her fingers bled. As soon as she began to play, Mr. Rodriguez knew he was witnessing something extraordinary. Elena's technique was rough around the edges and her interpretation was unconventional, but her natural musicality and emotional depth were undeniable. She played with a passion and intensity that most formally trained musicians spent years trying to develop. When she finished, the room fell silent except for the sound of Mr. Rodriguez's sharp intake of breath. He had tears in his eyes, something Elena had never seen from a teacher before. "Elena," he said slowly, "how long have you been playing?" "Since I was 8, she replied, still not looking up from the keys. "Who taught you to play like this?" Elena shrugged. "Nobody. I just listen to music and try to copy it." Mr. Rodriguez sat down heavily in a nearby chair, trying to process what he had just heard. In all his years of teaching, he had never encountered a student with this level of natural ability combined with such dedication to self-improvement. Elena wasn't just talented, she was a musical prodigy who had been hiding in plain sight. Over the next few weeks, Mr. Rodriguez worked with Elena after school, helping her refine her technique and introducing her to more challenging pieces. He was amazed by how quickly she absorbed everything he taught her, and how she brought her own unique interpretation to every piece of music she touched. But Mr. Rodriguez knew that Elena's talent was too big for their small school music program. She needed opportunities that he couldn't provide, chances to perform for people who could recognize and nurture her gifts. He started researching competitions and scholarships, looking for ways to help Elena break through the barriers that poverty had built around her dreams. One evening, while Elena was practicing at home, she heard her phone buzzing with a text message from Mr. Rodriguez. "Can you stay after school tomorrow? I have something important to discuss with you." Elena's heart started racing. Had she done something wrong? Was she in trouble for spending so much time in the music room? She barely slept that night, wondering what her teacher wanted to talk about. The next day, Mr. Rodriguez showed Elena a flyer for a statewide piano competition. The winner would receive a full scholarship to a prestigious music conservatory and the opportunity to perform with professional orchestras. But the application deadline was only 2 weeks away, and Elena would need to submit a video recording of herself playing a challenging classical piece. "I think you should enter this competition," Mr. Rodriguez said, watching Elena's face carefully for her reaction. Elena's first instinct was to say no. Competitions were for rich kids who had been taking lessons since they were toddlers, kids who owned expensive pianos and performed in recitals wearing designer dresses. She was just a girl from East LA who had learned to play on a broken piano in a laundromat apartment. But Mr. Rodriguez saw the doubt in her eyes and knew exactly what she was thinking. "Elena," he said firmly, "talent doesn't care about where you come from or how much money your family has. You have a gift that most people would give anything to possess. Don't let fear keep you from sharing that gift with the world." That night, Elena sat at her old piano thinking about Mr. Rodriguez's words. Through the thin walls, she could hear her mother and brother watching TV in the next room, and below them, the familiar sounds of the laundromat's evening customers finishing their wash. This had been her world for 17 years, and part of her was terrified of stepping outside its familiar boundaries. But another part of her, the part that came alive when she played music, was tired of hiding. She thought about all the hours she had spent practicing, all the dreams she had kept locked inside her heart. all the music that was waiting to pour out of her fingers if she just had the courage to let it. Elena made a decision that would change. The next 2 weeks passed like a whirlwind for Elena. Every spare moment was dedicated to perfecting her competition piece, Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, one of the most challenging and emotionally demanding pieces in the classical piano repertoire. She had chosen it not because it was safe or easy, but because it spoke to something deep in her soul, telling a story of struggle and triumph that matched her own life. Mr. Rodriguez stayed after school every day to help her prepare, working with her on the technical difficulties and helping her understand the historical context of the piece. He had never seen a student work so hard, practicing until her fingers were sore and her back ached from hunching over the keys. Elena would arrive at school early just to get extra practice time on the music room's better piano, and she often stayed until the janitors had to ask her to leave. At home, Elena tried to explain to her family what she was doing, but they didn't really understand the significance of the competition. Her mother was worried about Elena spending so much time on music instead of focusing on her regular classes and her part-time job at a local grocery store. "Mija, music is beautiful, but it doesn't pay the bills," she would say with concern in her voice. Elena's younger brother Carlos thought the whole thing was weird. He couldn't understand why his sister would want to play boring old music when she could be listening to hip-hop or reggaeton like everyone else their age. But even he had to admit that when Elena played, something magical happened in their small apartment. The hardest part was recording the audition video. Elena's family didn't own a good camera, and the lighting in their apartment was terrible. Mr. Rodriguez offered to help, bringing his own equipment to school and working with Elena to find the best angles and sound quality. They recorded the video in the music room after school, with Elena wearing her only nice dress, a simple black outfit she had bought at a thrift store for her high school graduation photos. When Elena watched the finished video, she felt a mix of pride and terror. She could see herself playing with passion and skill, but she also noticed every small mistake, every moment where her technique wasn't perfect. She wondered if she was crazy to think she could compete against students who had been training at elite music schools their entire lives. But Mr. Rodriguez insisted the video was excellent, and together they submitted Elena's application just hours before the deadline. Then came the waiting period, 3 long weeks during which Elena tried to focus on her regular classes while constantly checking her email for news about the competition. The notification came on a Tuesday morning while Elena was in her chemistry class. Her phone buzzed with an email that made her heart stop. She had been selected as a finalist in the statewide piano competition, but as she read further, her excitement mixed with confusion. The email mentioned that her performance had caught the attention of someone unexpected. After school, Mr. Rodriguez called Elena into his office with a strange expression on his face. "Elena, I got a very interesting phone call today," he said, gesturing for her to sit down. "Someone saw your competition video and wants to offer you a different kind of opportunity." He explained that the video had somehow made its way to Beverly Hills, where it was viewed by Victoria Sterling, the director of the Beverly Hills Cultural Society. This organization hosted exclusive events for some of the wealthiest and most influential people in Los Angeles, and their monthly soirees were legendary for bringing together celebrities, business leaders, and cultural elite. "They need a pianist for their annual charity gala next month," Mr. Rodriguez continued. "Their original performer got sick, and Mrs. Sterling saw your video through a mutual contact. She wants you to perform for their guests." Elena felt like the world was spinning around her. "But Mr. Rodriguez, I've never performed for people like that. I don't know anything about high society or fancy parties. What if I mess up? What if they think I don't belong there?" Mr. Rodriguez leaned forward with intensity in his eyes. "Elena, this is the kind of opportunity that could change your entire life. These people have connections and resources that could open doors you never even knew existed. Yes, it's scary. And yes, you'll be stepping into a world that's completely different from anything you've experienced. But your music is universal. When you play, it doesn't matter where you come from or how much money you have. What matters is the emotion and beauty you create." That evening, Elena called the number Mr. Rodriguez had given her and spoke directly with Victoria Sterling. The woman's voice was polished and confident, with the kind of accent that suggested expensive education and a lifetime of privilege. But she was also surprisingly warm and enthusiastic about Elena's music. "My dear, your playing is absolutely exquisite," Victoria said. "It has been years since I've heard someone play with such genuine emotion. Our guests are accustomed to technically perfect performances, but what they rarely experience is music that truly moves the soul. I believe you could provide them with something truly special." Victoria explained that the gala would be held at a private mansion in Beverly Hills, with about 200 guests expected to attend. Elena would be paid $1,000 for her performance, more money than she had ever seen at one time. The dress code was formal, and Elena would need to prepare a 30-minute program of classical pieces. After hanging up the phone, Elena sat at her old piano in a daze. $1,000 could help her family pay rent for 2 months. It could buy her brother new school clothes and help her mother reduce her working hours. But more than the money, this was a chance to share her music with people who had the power to change her future. The next few weeks were a blur of preparation and anxiety. Elena worked with Mr. Rodriguez to select the perfect pieces for her program, choosing music that would showcase her technical skills while also demonstrating her emotional depth. They settled on a mix of Chopin, Mozart, and Debussy, pieces that were familiar enough for the audience to appreciate but challenging enough to impress serious music lovers. The biggest challenge was finding something appropriate to wear. Elena's mother offered to buy her a new dress, but even the cheapest formal gowns were far beyond their family's budget. That's when Mrs. Chen, the elderly woman who ran the dry cleaning business next to their laundromat, offered an unexpected solution. "I have been saving this dress for 40 years, Mrs. Chen said, pulling out a stunning navy blue gown from her closet. "I wore it to my daughter's wedding, and it has been waiting for the right occasion ever since. You are exactly the same size I was at your age." The dress was simple but elegant, with clean lines and a classic style that would never go out of fashion. When Elena tried it on, she looked like a completely different person, someone who belonged in the world she was about to enter. As the date of the gala approached, Elena's nerves grew stronger. She practiced her program until she could play every note in her sleep, but she still worried about performing for an audience unlike any she had ever encountered. What if they didn't appreciate her style of playing? What if they thought she was too young or inexperienced? What if she made a mistake that embarrassed not just herself, but also Mr. Rodriguez and everyone who had believed in her? 3 days before the gala, Elena received a surprise visitor at school. Victoria Sterling arrived in a silver Mercedes, looking exactly like Elena had imagined a wealthy socialite would look. She was perfectly dressed in a cream-colored suit, with jewelry that probably cost more than Elena's family made in a year. But when Victoria heard Elena play, her carefully composed expression melted into genuine amazement. "Oh, my dear," she whispered when Elena finished playing a Chopin nocturne. "You are going to absolutely captivate our guests. I have a feeling this performance is going to be talked about for years to come." Victoria's confidence was reassuring, but Elena still felt the weight of the opportunity pressing down on her shoulders. This wasn't just a chance to perform for wealthy people. It was a doorway to a completely different world, one where music was valued and supported in ways she had never experienced. The night before the gala, Elena barely slept. She lay in bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the laundromat below, wondering if this would be one of the last nights she spent in this apartment, not because she expected to become rich overnight, but because she sensed that after tomorrow night, nothing in her life would ever be quite the same. She thought about her grandmother Rosa, who had rescued that old piano from the church and somehow known that it would be important someday. She thought about Mr. Rodriguez, who had seen her potential when she was just another student trying to get through high school. And she thought about all the hours she had spent practicing, all the dreams she had kept hidden, all the music that was waiting to pour out of her heart. Tomorrow night, Elena Martinez would walk into a mansion filled with the most powerful and influential people in Los Angeles. She would sit down at a piano that probably cost more than her family's car, and she would play music that came from the deepest parts of her soul. She had no idea that among the guests would be someone who would recognize not just her talent, but something even more surprising about her family's hidden past. She didn't know that her performance would lead to discoveries that the mansion in Beverly Hills looked like something out of a fairy tale as Elena stepped out of Mr. Rodriguez's old Honda Civic. Tall iron gates opened automatically as they approached, revealing a circular driveway lined with perfectly manicured gardens and fountains that sparkled under carefully placed lighting. The house itself was massive, with white columns and arched windows that glowed warmly against the evening sky. Elena's hands were trembling as she smoothed down Mrs. Chen's navy blue dress one more time. She had spent an hour getting ready, with her mother helping her fix her hair into an elegant updo and applying just enough makeup to look sophisticated without feeling like she was wearing a costume. But now, standing in front of this palatial home, Elena felt like she was about to walk onto the stage of a theater where she didn't know her lines. "You look beautiful, mija," Mr. Rodriguez said gently, noticing her nervousness. "Remember, they invited you here because of your music, not because of where you come from. Your talent speaks for itself." Victoria Sterling met them at the front door, looking radiant in a flowing silver gown that probably cost more than Elena's family made in 6 months. But her smile was genuine and warm as she greeted Elena with enthusiasm. "Elena, darling, you look absolutely stunning," Victoria said, taking Elena's hands in hers. "Are you ready to meet some wonderful people who are going to fall in love with your music?" As they walked through the front entrance, Elena felt like she was entering a different world entirely. The foyer alone was larger than her family's entire apartment, with marble floors that reflected the light from an enormous crystal chandelier hanging overhead. Paintings in ornate golden frames lined the walls, and fresh flowers in massive arrangements filled the air with a sweet perfume. The main reception room was even more overwhelming. About 200 guests mingled throughout the space, all dressed in the kind of formal attire that Elena had only seen in movies. Women wore designer gowns in every color imaginable, sparkling with jewelry that caught the light as they moved. Men stood in perfectly tailored tuxedos, their conversations mixing business deals with cultural commentary, in voices that carried the confidence of people accustomed to being heard. Elena recognized several faces from entertainment magazines and news programs. There was a famous actress who had won an Academy Award the previous year, chatting with a tech billionaire whose company name was known around the world. A renowned surgeon was deep in conversation with a federal judge, while nearby, a best-selling author was discussing her latest novel with a museum director. "Come, let me introduce you to a few people before your performance," Victoria said, guiding Elena through the crowd with the skill of someone who had been hosting these events for decades. The conversations were polite but brief, with guests expressing curiosity about the young pianist they would be hearing that evening. Elena answered their questions as best she could, trying not to let her nervousness show as she explained that she was mostly self-taught and had learned to play on her grandmother's rescued piano. But Elena noticed something interesting as she talked with various guests. While they were all wealthy and accomplished, many of them seemed hungry for something authentic, something real that their privileged lives didn't often provide. They were intrigued by her story, not because it was unusual to them, but because it represented a kind of passion and determination that money couldn't buy. As the evening progressed, Elena found herself relaxing slightly. These people might live in a different world, but they were still human beings who appreciated music and artistry. Some of them shared stories about their own attempts to learn instruments as children, and others talked about concerts they had attended that had moved them to tears. Finally, Victoria announced that it was time for the musical performance. Guests gradually moved toward the far end of the reception room, where a magnificent Steinway grand piano sat positioned near tall windows that looked out over the city lights below. The piano was a work of art in itself, with a glossy black finish that reflected the room's elegant lighting like a mirror. Elena had never seen such a beautiful instrument, let alone played one. As she approached the piano bench, she could feel the weight of 200 pairs of eyes watching her every move. The room fell silent except for the soft sound of her footsteps on the marble floor and the distant hum of evening traffic from the city below. She sat down at the bench and adjusted her position, placing her hands gently on the keys. The piano was perfectly tuned and incredibly responsive, with a rich, warm tone that filled the room even with the softest touch. Elena took a deep breath and tried to forget about the audience, focusing instead on the music that lived inside her heart. She had decided to begin her program with Chopin's Ballade No. 1, the same piece she had prepared for the competition video. But as her fingers found their positions on the keys, Elena realized that this moment was about much more than technical perfection or impressing wealthy strangers. This was about sharing the deepest part of herself through the language of music. The first notes floated through the room like whispered secrets, immediately capturing the attention of every person present. Elena's interpretation of the piece was unlike anything most of the guests had ever heard. While technically trained pianists often focused on precision and academic correctness, Elena played with raw emotion and personal experience that transformed the music into something living and breathing. She poured 17 years of dreams and struggles into those keys, 17 years of practicing on a broken piano while washing machines hummed below, 17 years of wondering if her music would ever be heard by anyone who could understand its beauty. The melody soared and dipped like a conversation between her heart and the universe, telling a story that transcended words or social boundaries. As Elena played, something magical began to happen in the room. Conversations stopped completely, as guests found themselves drawn into the emotional landscape she was creating. Some people moved closer to the piano, their faces reflecting the wonder of discovering something unexpectedly profound. Others stood perfectly still, tears beginning to form in their eyes as the music touched places in their hearts they had forgotten existed. Among the audience, David Chen, a renowned music producer who had worked with some of the biggest names in classical music, felt his breath catch in his throat. He had attended thousands of performances throughout his career, but he had never heard anyone play with such authentic emotional depth. Elena wasn't just performing music. She was channeling something pure and powerful that most musicians spent their entire careers trying to access. The Chopin piece built to its dramatic climax, with Elena's fingers dancing across the keys in passages that required both technical skill and incredible emotional control. But she handled every challenging section with confidence, her self-taught technique proving more than adequate for the demands of the music. When she reached the piece's peaceful conclusion, the final notes seemed to hang in the air for several moments before slowly fading into silence. The room remained quiet for what felt like an eternity, as if the guests were afraid that speaking would break the spell Elena had cast. Then slowly the applause began. First from David Chen, then spreading throughout the room until it became a thunderous ovation that seemed to shake the crystal chandelier overhead. Elena looked up from the piano with surprise and relief, hardly believing the response she was receiving. These people, who attended world-class performances regularly and had probably heard the greatest musicians alive, were giving her a standing ovation that felt genuine and heartfelt. But as she scanned the faces in the crowd, Elena's eyes suddenly stopped on someone that made her heart skip a beat. Standing near the back of the room, partially hidden behind other guests, was a man she hadn't seen in 10 years but would never forget. It was her uncle Carlos, her father's younger brother, who had disappeared from their lives after her father's funeral when Elena was just 7 years old. Carlos looked older now, with gray streaking his dark hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of years she knew nothing about. But there was no mistaking his face, and there was no mistaking the expression of shock and recognition in his eyes as he stared back at her. He was well dressed in an expensive tuxedo that suggested he belonged among these wealthy guests, which made no sense to Elena at all. Elena's mind raced with confusion and questions. How was Carlos here? How could he afford to attend an event like this? Why had he stayed away from their family for so long? And why was he appearing now, at this moment when her life was about to change? Victoria Sterling approached the piano, with tears in her eyes, ready to introduce Elena to the enthusiastic crowd. But Elena found herself unable to focus on anything except her uncle's familiar face, staring at her from across the room. She had just delivered the performance of her lifetime, but suddenly all she could think about was the family mystery that had just walked back into her life. As the applause continued and guests began approaching the piano to congratulate her, Elena realized that this evening was far from over. Her performance had been everything she had hoped it would be, but something told her that the real surprises were just beginning. Elena stood frozen at the piano bench, her heart pounding as she watched her Uncle Carlos navigate through the crowd of well-dressed guests. He moved with purpose, his eyes never leaving her face, and Elena could see a mixture of emotions playing across his features: surprise, pride, and something that looked almost like guilt. The guests continued to surround Elena with congratulations and praise, but their voices seemed to fade into background noise as she watched Carlos approach. Victoria Sterling was beside her, glowing with satisfaction at the evening's success, introducing Elena to important guests who wanted to discuss future performance opportunities. But Elena could barely focus on their words. "Elena, darling, I'd like you to meet Dr. Patterson, who runs the music program at UCLA," Victoria was saying when Carlos finally reached the piano area. "Excuse me," Carlos said politely, his voice carrying a slight tremor that Elena remembered from childhood. "I was wondering if I might have a word with the young lady. I believe we may have some mutual friends." Elena's mouth went dry. She hadn't heard her uncle's voice in 10 years, but it was exactly as she remembered, warm and gentle, with the same slight accent that her father had carried from their childhood in Mexico. Victoria looked between Elena and Carlos with curiosity, sensing some kind of connection she didn't understand. "Of course," Victoria said graciously. "Elena, why don't you take a few minutes to catch your breath? I'll continue introducing you to our guests afterward." Carlos gestured toward a quieter corner of the room, near the tall windows that overlooked the twinkling lights of Beverly Hills below. Elena followed him on unsteady legs, her mind racing with questions that had been buried for years. "Tio Carlos?" she whispered when they were away from the crowd. "What are you doing here? How can you afford to be at a party like this?" Carlos looked at her with eyes that were suspiciously bright, as if he was fighting back tears. "Elena, mija, you look so much like your father when he was young. And you're playing. Dios mío, I never expected to hear music like that again." "Again?" Elena asked, confused. "What do you mean, again?" Carlos glanced around the room, making sure they weren't being overheard, then looked back at Elena with an expression that seemed to carry the weight of years of secrets. "Elena, there are things about your father that your mother never told you, things that I promised I would keep secret after he died. But hearing you play tonight, I think it's time you knew the truth about your family." Elena felt the world shifting beneath her feet. "What truth? What are you talking about?" Carlos took a deep breath before continuing. "Your father wasn't just a man who worked in a laundromat, Elena. Before you were born, before he met your mother, he was a classical musician, a very successful one." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. She stared at her uncle in disbelief, trying to process what he was telling her. "That's impossible. Papa never played music. We never even had a piano until Abuela Rosa brought that old one from the church." "That piano didn't come from a church, mija," Carlos said gently. "It came from your father's apartment. After he died, I couldn't bear to tell your mother the truth about it, so I made up the story about the church. But that piano was his, the one he composed on and practiced on for years before he gave up music to support his family." Elena's legs felt weak and she reached out to steady herself against the window frame. "Composed? What do you mean composed?" Carlos pulled out his phone and showed Elena a photograph that made her gasp. It was her father as a young man, sitting at the same old piano that now lived in their apartment. But in the photo, the piano looked new and beautiful, positioned in an elegant room with music sheets scattered across its surface. "Your father, Ricardo Martinez, was a composer and pianist who wrote music for films and classical ensembles," Carlos explained. "He studied at the conservatory, performed with orchestras, and wrote pieces that are still being played today. But when he fell in love with your mother and found out she was pregnant with you, he made a choice. He gave up his music career to provide a more stable life for his family." Elena stared at the photograph, seeing her father's face filled with the same joy and passion she felt when she played music. "But why didn't he teach me? Why didn't he tell me?" "Because he wanted you to have a normal childhood, without the pressure and uncertainty that comes with a life in music," Carlos said. "He saw how difficult the music industry could be, how many talented people struggled to make a living. He wanted better for you. But I ended up choosing music anyway, Elena whispered. Yes, and that's because it's in your blood, mija. You didn't learn to play piano just because you found an old instrument. You learned because music is part of who you are at the deepest level. Carlos paused, looking around the elegant room filled with wealthy guests, then continued with an expression Elena couldn't quite read. Elena, there's something else you need to know. Something that might explain how I can afford to be at a party like this, and something that's going to change your life in ways you can't imagine. What do you mean? Your father's compositions. They became very successful after he died. Film studios have been using his music in movies for the past 10 years, and his classical pieces have been performed by orchestras around the world. The royalties from his work have been accumulating in an account that he left in trust. Elena felt like the ground was disappearing beneath her feet. Royalties? What royalties? Elena, your father left you and your family the rights to all of his musical compositions. That includes the piece you just performed. Chopin's Ballade No. 1 was one of his favorite pieces, and he wrote several variations on it that are now worth a significant amount of money. Elena's mind was reeling. But we don't have any money. My mother works double shifts. We can barely pay rent. Because nobody knew about the trust account except me, and I've been too ashamed to contact your family after the way I disappeared, Carlos said, his voice breaking slightly. After your father died, I couldn't handle the grief. I moved away, changed my life completely, and I've been managing his musical estate while trying to figure out how to reconnect with you and your mother. Managing his estate? Elena repeated. Carlos nodded. I work in music publishing now, Elena. I've spent the last 10 years making sure your father's compositions reach the right people and generate income for his family. That's how I could afford to be here tonight, and that's how I know that the performance you just gave was worth more than just applause. Elena looked back toward the piano where she had just played, then at the crowd of wealthy guests who were still discussing her performance with enthusiasm. How much money are we talking about? Enough to change your family's life completely, Carlos said softly. Enough to pay for your mother to quit her job at the restaurant, enough to send you to any music school in the world, enough to ensure that you never have to worry about choosing between your music and your family's financial security. Elena felt tears starting to flow down her cheeks as the full weight of her uncle's revelation sank in. Her father, who she had remembered as a quiet man who worked hard to support his family, had actually been a successful musician who had sacrificed his career for love. The old piano she had learned on wasn't a rescue from a church. It was her father's instrument, the place where he had created beautiful music that was still touching people's lives years after his death. Why are you telling me this now? Elena asked through her tears. Carlos looked toward the crowd of guests, many of whom were still talking about Elena's performance with obvious excitement. Because tonight, watching you play your father's favorite piece for these people, I realized that keeping his secret wasn't protecting you anymore. It was holding you back. You have inherited not just his musical ability, but his compositions, his legacy, and the financial security that comes with it. Does my mother know? Not yet. I was hoping you could help me figure out how to tell her. It's going to be a shock, and there will be legal paperwork to sort through, but Elena, your family will never have to struggle financially again. Elena looked around the elegant mansion, at the wealthy guests who had just given her a standing ovation, at her uncle who had just revealed that everything she thought she knew about her family was wrong. The evening had started with her stepping into a foreign world of privilege and sophistication, but now she was discovering that she had actually been stepping into her birthright. She thought about her mother working double shifts at the restaurant, about her brother wearing hand-me-down clothes, about all the times they had worried about paying rent or buying groceries. All that struggle could end immediately, and she could pursue her musical dreams without the fear of leaving her family behind. But as Elena processed this incredible news, she also realized that having money would bring new choices and new responsibilities. What would she do with this unexpected inheritance? How would it change her family's dynamics? And most importantly, how could she honor her father's memory while building her own musical legacy? David Chen, The music producer who had been so impressed with her performance was approaching them with an expression of excitement. Elena could see that her evening of revelations was far from over, and that the performance that had begun this in 3 months after that life-changing evening in Beverly Hills, Elena Martinez sat in a boardroom that overlooked downtown Los Angeles, surrounded by lawyers, financial advisors, and music industry executives. The paperwork spread across the mahogany table represented the formal transfer of her father's musical estate, worth just over $3 million in accumulated royalties and ongoing revenue streams. But instead of the excitement everyone expected her to feel, Elena found herself thinking about a conversation she'd had with her mother the night before. "Mija, this money is a blessing, but it's also a test," Rosa Maria had said while they sat together in their apartment above the laundromat. "Your father chose to give up fame and fortune to take care of his family. What are you going to choose to do with the gifts he left you?" The conversation with her mother had kept Elena awake most of the night, wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. David Chen, the music producer who had approached her at the gala, was offering her a recording contract that could make her a classical music star. Music schools across the country were competing to offer her full scholarships. Wealthy patrons were inviting her to perform at exclusive events for fees that exceeded her family's annual income. But something about all these opportunities felt wrong to Elena, as if they were taking her away from the very thing that made her music special in the first place. She remembered the feeling of playing on her father's old piano, channeling years of struggle and hope into melodies that seemed to pour directly from her heart. That authenticity, that connection to real human experience, was what had made her performance so powerful that night in Beverly Hills. "Miss Martinez," said the lead attorney, interrupting her thoughts, "we just need your signature on these final documents and the estate transfer will be complete. You'll have full control over your father's compositions and all future royalties." Elena picked up the expensive pen they had provided, but instead of signing immediately, she set it down and looked around the room at all the people who were waiting to profit from her decisions. "I need to ask you all something," Elena said, quietly. "How many young musicians like me are out there right now, practicing on broken pianos in small apartments, dreaming of opportunities that seem impossible to reach?" David Chen leaned forward with interest. "Probably thousands, Elena. But that's exactly why your story is so powerful. You represent hope for kids who think classical music isn't for them." "Exactly," Elena said, her voice growing stronger. "And that's why I've decided to do something different with this inheritance." The room fell silent as Elena stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the sprawling city below. Somewhere out there she knew there were children just like her. Children with musical gifts they were too poor or too afraid to pursue. "I'm not going to sign a recording contract right now," Elena announced, turning back to face the surprised group. "And I'm not going to use this money to launch my own solo career." David Chen looked shocked. "Elena, I don't understand. This is exactly the kind of opportunity most musicians dream about their entire lives." "I know," Elena replied calmly. "But I've realized that my father's greatest composition wasn't something he wrote for an orchestra or a film score. His greatest creation was the choice to sacrifice his own dreams so that his family could have better opportunities. I want to honor that legacy." Elena walked back to the table and picked up the pen again. "I'm going to sign these papers, but not so I can become rich and famous. I'm going to use this money to create something that would make my father proud." Over the next hour, Elena outlined her vision to the stunned group of advisors. She wanted to establish the Ricardo Martinez Foundation for Musical Education, a non-profit organization dedicated to bringing classical music education to underserved communities throughout Los Angeles. The foundation would provide free instruments, lessons, and performance opportunities to children who otherwise would never have access to such programs. "But Elena," protested one of the financial advisors, "you could be a millionaire. You could have anything you want." "I already have everything I want," Elena replied with conviction. "I have music, I have my family, and now I have the opportunity to share what I've learned with other kids who are exactly where I was a year ago." David Chen, who had initially been disappointed by Elena's decision, found himself becoming intrigued by her vision. What if we could do both, he suggested. What if I helped you create a foundation, but we also developed a documentary about your story and your work with young musicians? We could use your performances to raise awareness and funding for the foundation. Elena's eyes lit up at this suggestion. That could work, but the focus has to be on the kids we're helping, not on making me famous. Within 6 months, the Ricardo Martinez Foundation was operating out of a renovated warehouse in East Los Angeles, just a few miles from where Elena had grown up. The space was filled with donated pianos, violins, cellos, and other instruments, along with practice rooms where children could work with professional instructors who believed in Elena's mission. Elena's mother, Rosa Maria, left her job at the restaurant to become the foundation's administrative director, her natural warmth and organizational skills proving perfect for managing the program's daily operations. Elena's brother Carlos, inspired by his sister's transformation, began studying music education in college with the goal of joining the foundation as a teacher. Uncle Carlos, who had been instrumental in revealing the family's musical heritage, became the foundation's musical director. His years of experience in music publishing proved invaluable, as he helped design curriculum and recruit talented instructors who shared Elena's passion for making classical music accessible to everyone. The Foundation's first performance showcase, held 18 months after Elena's breakthrough evening in Beverly Hills, was unlike anything the classical music world had ever seen. The venue was the Walt Disney Concert Hall, but instead of featuring established professionals, the stage was filled with children from across Los Angeles who had discovered their musical voices through the Foundation's programs. There was Miguel, a 10-year-old violinist whose family had immigrated from Guatemala, playing a piece he had composed about his grandmother's stories. There was Aisha, a 12-year-old cellist from Watts who had never seen a classical instrument before joining the Foundation, now performing with the confidence of someone who had been studying music her entire life. There was Danny, a shy 14-year-old pianist who had been afraid to play in front of anyone, now leading an ensemble of his peers in a piece that brought the audience to tears. Elena performed that evening too, playing her father's own composition that had never been heard publicly before, a piece he had written for her when she was born, found among his papers in Carlos's possession. But the real stars of the evening were the dozens of young musicians who proved that talent and passion could flourish anywhere when given the right support and opportunities. David Chen, who had filmed the Foundation's work over the past year, premiered his documentary that night. The Piano Rescue told Elena's story, but more importantly, it showed how one person's decision to give back could create ripple effects that changed entire communities. The film would go on to win several awards and inspire similar foundations in cities across the country. As Elena watched her students perform that night, she thought about the choice her father had made years earlier to give up his musical career for his family's security. She had made a different choice, but one that honored the same values, putting service to others above personal ambition, using her gifts to lift up people who needed opportunities more than she needed fame. The foundation continued to grow, eventually expanding to serve thousands of students across Southern California. Elena continued to perform, but her concerts became fundraising events for the foundation, and her recordings were released to support music education programs worldwide. She never became the classical music superstar that David Chen had originally envisioned, but she became something more important, a catalyst for change that made classical music accessible to children who had been told it wasn't for them. 5. Years after that first performance in Beverly Hills, Elena received a letter that brought tears to her eyes. It was from Miguel, the young violinist who had played his grandmother's stories at that first showcase. He had just been accepted to the Juilliard School with a full scholarship, and he wanted to thank Elena for showing him that dreams were possible regardless of where you started in life. I used to think classical music was only for rich kids who lived in big houses, Miguel wrote. But you taught me that music belongs to everyone who has something to say with their heart. I'm going to study hard and come back to teach at the foundation someday, because I want to help other kids the way you helped me. Elena folded the letter carefully and placed it in her desk drawer next to dozens of similar letters from students, whose lives had been changed by the foundation's work. She looked around her office, which was decorated not with awards or publicity photos, but with pictures of children at pianos, violins tucked under their chins, and faces glowing with the joy of musical discovery.